This is episode 110 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week, we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. And Wally, with a lot of folks traveling over the Independence Day holiday, including yours truly, not as many policy issues to discuss in a timely fashion, I figured we would take another deep dive into a New Mexico public policy issue with which we often deal on the website, on these podcasts, I should say, and the Rio Grande Foundation website and our opinion pieces, et cetera. And this week, we're going to talk about the gross receipts tax, which, as the name implies, is gross. No, I'm just kidding there, folks. That's not where the gross receipts tax gets its name.
But it could have.
It could, yes. Before we get started into some of the nuts and bolts here, why don't you do a lot of work as a contractor. Those are some of the folks that have to deal most notably with the gross receipts tax. Just a few, any personal experiences you want to share with what that tax means to your business or business in general.
Yes, well, small businesses tend to use contractors, and I do. And if you use an in-state contractor, they charge you gross receipts tax. Out-of-state contractors, the federal law is changing, and they're trying to get them more and more, but they certainly haven't done it on services, where if a service originates and is provided out of state, they don't tend to charge gross receipts tax unless they have a thing called a nexus in New Mexico, basically a New Mexico office. So when it's, gross receipts tax, 7-8%, an out-of-state contractor is 7 or 8% ahead of an in-state contractor on services. And, somebody who lives here, I certainly like, all things being equal, would certainly rather use a contractor who's next door as opposed to somewhere across the nation or across the world. But that's just one of the incentives. And then there are a lot of exemptions, a lot of exceptions to gross receipts tax. It just doesn't seem like I qualify for those very much. I'm not a small business, not necessarily the sweet spot of those that have had carve-outs over the years for gross receipts tax.
No doubt about it. So before we get too deep into this conversation, it is always important to define your terms. You go to Wikipedia and you find the definition of a gross receipts tax, and I think it's a good definition. Wikipedia sometimes can offer sketchy facts, but in this particular case, a gross receipts tax is defined as a tax on the total gross revenues of a company regardless of their source. It is similar to a sales tax, but is levied on the seller of goods or service consumers. This is compared to other taxes listed as separate line items on billings, are not directly included in the listed price of the item, and are not a factor in markup or profit on the company's sales. A gross receipts tax has a pyramid effect that increases the actual taxable percentage as it passes through the product, service, or life cycle. And starting off with a quick criticism, which this is from their, again, Wikipedia site. Economists have criticized gross receipts taxes for encouraging vertical integration among companies and imposing different effective tax rates across different industries. And that you're dealing with a unique tax when you have very little agreement over what kind of tax is actually levied in the various states. Still sticking with Wikipedia, you have states that impose gross receipts taxes: Alabama, Delaware, Florida, Hawaii, Illinois, Nevada, New Mexico, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. But if you go to the Tax Foundation's website, they claim that New Mexico does not charge a gross receipts tax, nor does Hawaii. The reason is it's very complicated, but basically Tax Foundation argues that New Mexico's gross receipts tax does not resemble a true gross receipts tax due to the carve-outs, due to the changes that have been made over the years. I would certainly beg to differ with the Tax Foundation on that. Nonetheless, we're going to use a 10 principles of sound tax policy and use that as kind of a framework. This is from the Tax Foundation in their discussion, use this as a discussion tool for the gross receipts tax. And transparency is a must. While there is no less transparent tax I can think of than the gross receipts tax, it is not only charged, the pyramiding impact.
See, yes, that's where it's the least transparent, is it can get layered and layered and layered, and all you see is the last tax that you pay. You don't see all the taxes that went into all the components for whatever you bought from a product or service point of view.
Right, and why the Tax Foundation would say that we don't have a gross receipts tax in New Mexico is because of carve-outs that have been implemented over the years, but vice versa, or comparing with that, is the fact that the people who are impacted, i.e. the businesses or industries that will go up to Santa Fe and lobby against a gross receipts tax or lobby for the exemptions and deductions, are the only ones who really know that there are these exemptions and deductions. The average citizen does not, A, have the power to address the issue, and B, they largely don't even know that these taxes are levied on their business. So you're an independent contractor, you do a lot of this, you certainly are abundantly aware of gross receipts tax, but Joe Schmo working for a paycheck out there probably has no idea what's happening.
Yeah, with the Tax Foundation position that, maybe New Mexico doesn't have a gross receipts tax, I would argue maybe I'll accept them at face value, say, yeah, it's even worse than a typical gross receipts tax, because in general, we still tend to tax most services, and the carve-outs tend to be for some very specific products and some other interesting transactions that, as you say, do not impact the typical business person, the typical person operating a business or some other economic endeavor in New Mexico. And so, the idea, as I was told, was from the forefathers of New Mexico tax policy was that it was supposed to be a broad tax, and it's gotten to be not that broad. But anytime you tax services for this tax, it's certainly not a sales tax. And if it's not a gross receipts tax from the Tax Foundation, I think it's an even worse hybrid here in New Mexico than if everything was taxed as the Tax Foundation would like it to be called a gross receipts tax.
Yeah, it is politically motivated in the sense that what is taxed and not taxed really has a lot to do with your ability to influence policy. In Santa Fe, Tax Foundation continues neutrality. That means that a tax hits everything basically equitably. You're not picking and choosing either whether it's inherent in the system or through the legislative process. Broad base. Broad base is something, again, you want a tax that hits every area of the economy, but it doesn't pyramid. It doesn't have exemptions and deductions. And if you're going to do this with taxation, the gross receipts tax, you want everything to be taxed once and not more than once. But unfortunately, that's not the way things go. Keep it simple. We already discussed that. There's a few others, but not necessarily applicable. However, number 7, keep tax burdens low. And the gross receipts tax is really a great vehicle for policymakers to increase tax burdens, because they're able to very easily in New Mexico increase, especially at the local level, how much tax is paid. We saw this in Albuquerque in March of 2018, where City Council adopted a 3/8 cents on the dollar gross receipts tax increase just by a straight up vote of the city council with no citizen involvement, no legislative referendum, no nothing. Very hard to control this kind of taxation policy in New Mexico.
Yeah, and I think in that case, we got the worst of local control and state control when it comes to governance in that, and that the state just washed its hands of what is overall bad tax policy in the gross receipts tax and say, well, we're not going to raise it, but we're going to make it easy for you to raise it, local governments. And that's exactly what they did. And it exacerbated the problem. And then you hear time and time again that municipalities are creatures of gross receipts tax financing. This is very important to them. It's a big part of it. And so anytime now that you start to look at ways of reform, the system, as bad as it is the devil that municipalities know. And they're one of the strongest opponents of any sort of reform that I've seen in Santa Fe over the years. And so, yeah, you have these widely dispersed business people that don't have a good lobbying arm, and you have a lot of vested interest in the current system, as bad as it is, to keep it there because they don't want to be put at any risk. And I guess you can see that point of view, but again, not solid tax policy, and it certainly is hurting economic growth in New Mexico. And if it isn't, I don't know what else would be hurting it, because we've certainly lagged behind our neighbors, as you've gone over many podcasts over the last decade here in New Mexico. And I think that our gross receipts tax has to be one of the top 2 or 3 things contributing to that.
Yeah, I would say that it's the original sin of New Mexico tax policy, really economic policy in general. It is the single greatest problem. And I'll get into it in a minute, but the Albuquerque Journal just had a great editorial. The time is right for New Mexico to finally reform its tax code. But this has been an issue of discussion in Santa Fe. It was not talked about much in 2019. Progressives took over with the whole government under their control, including the governor's mansion for the first time in a while. And they had a lot of other priorities. But we have this $400,000 study from Ernst & Young and Georgia State University. It's worth the read. You can find it on the legislature's website. They have a lot of great information. It's a 66-page discussion of the gross receipts tax, and that gets back to the complexity issue. And we talked about its impact on business, but one of the things that specifically we should address with regard to the gross receipts tax is that it impacts small businesses and entrepreneurs more so than it does other businesses. In fact, the report itself on page 5 discusses how unprofitable and entrepreneurial startups have to pay taxes in New Mexico under the gross receipts tax, regardless of their profitability status, whereas under a sales tax, which is point of sale, New Mexico, those people are not forced to pay the kinds of taxes that they are in New Mexico. And you really have to start off with a lot of small businesses to build up your economic portfolio. The growth of those companies, they turn into tomorrow's Fortune 500 businesses. But New Mexico, almost through the gross receipts tax, by state policy, strangles small businesses in the crib and either forces them out of state or causes them to never darken our doorstep simply by imposing this onerous tax on them.
Yeah, and it is interesting that those who argue in Santa Fe about the progressive and regressive nature of taxes, those taxes that take a higher percentage of income for a certain demographic. It is a very regressive tax because it hits everybody. It doesn't matter. You may have the earned income tax credit, meaning the federal government pays you. You don't pay federal income taxes. You wouldn't pay any state income taxes, but you pay this on many, many things that you buy and the commodities of daily living, with the exception of food and a few other big things. Food in a grocery store, not taxed. Food in a restaurant, taxed. Just a simple example of where there's a lot of disparities and creates a lot of confusion and disruption.
Yeah, regressive nature of taxation is one of the other issues with the gross receipts tax. It is funny to us from a political standpoint that when you hear constant bleedings in Santa Fe and at local government levels for bigger governments and more spending, more progressivity in taxation, the poor, et cetera, et cetera. And then government, especially local governments in recent years, talk about raising the gross receipts tax. You never see folks from the Voices for Children or other lefty and progressive folks speaking out about raising the gross receipts tax, despite its regressive nature. And regressive, again, defining the terms, it doesn't mean that you're taking more money out of poor people's pockets. It does not mean that. The left will like to make that conflation.
They don't pay a higher rate.
Exactly. It is that as a percentage of your income, the gross receipts tax takes more out of low income level folks' pocketbooks. And that's a very complicated issue, but the flip side is progressive, as in rates go up as incomes go up. The U.S. federal income tax is the classic example of that. Most sales taxes and gross receipts taxes are regressive because they're charged at one rate regardless of income. And we can talk ad nauseum about where United States, where New Mexico should go in terms of more broad fundamental tax reforms, but we can't do anything in New Mexico in that vein until we address the fundamental flaws of the gross receipts tax and challenges there.
Yeah, and you bring up an excellent point. When the income tax rates in New Mexico were being lowered, you hear these advocates for the poor, Voices for Children, and many others like that, basically scream bloody murder about that. And then when you had the local option ability to raise gross receipts tax, it was crickets. You did not hear anything. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, unless it's the fact that when it puts risk on government or local governments more of a favored class relative to these advocates than even the poor people that live in them, it's a little bit tough from a logic point of view to put that all together because, yeah, the gross receipts tax shouldn't be as popular with a lot of the people in New Mexico if they are in any way, shape, or form true to their underlying principles and philosophies that they espouse.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think New Mexico in its left wing is a precursor, if you will, or ahead of the curve when it comes to this philosophy. I think around the country, the left has traditionally been more concerned about uplifting the poor, whereas in New Mexico, because of our government-centric approach to issues, the left has always been captured by big government and growing government first, with the impact on the poor as a secondary factor. And of course, I don't have to tell you or anybody listening to this podcast that New Mexico, and we had an op-ed that ran around the state, kind of attacking the Voices for Children's use of the Kids Count report. New Mexico has always struggled with living conditions for its children, the conditions relative to other states, most of that involving poverty. And of course, how do you get more people, including children, out of poverty? You build the private sector, you create jobs, you create sustainable opportunities for, in this case, parents of children who can then support those children. That's one of the primary ways that we could improve living conditions for our children. And yet this is just not talked about on the political left in New Mexico.
Yeah, so the thought occurred to me is that maybe Voices for Children is just as much voices for government, and I think that that point has been made before, but this whole issue really brings that into sharp focus.
You got it, and this is something I happened to discover. So Move On, the left-wing organization. Now, in this case, Move On is a platform simply for a petition that somebody has put forth. You can go online and look at this. Medicaid reimbursement should not be subject to gross receipts tax. And this is one of those other areas where the left-wing, at least organizational philosophy, is geared towards bigger government, whereas they should be looking at the negative impacts of the gross receipts tax on people actually receiving government services. I'm not going to read this entire petition, but it's to the governor, it's to the legislature, and it starts out, I am a clinical psychologist currently working with Native American youth and families in New Mexico. New Mexico charges gross receipts tax on Medicaid and Medicare federal monies. Of course, this is a great pipeline to big government when the state of New Mexico immediately takes a cut of federal dollars, supposedly for the benefit of low-income and needy people, or in the case of Medicare seniors. The individual in this petition writes, as a private practitioner who serves almost exclusively Native youth and families, I receive about 96% of my income from Medicaid. I feel that I and others who take Medicaid and Medicaid fee-for-service dollars are unfairly penalized by having to pay gross receipts tax on reimbursements or disbursements from insurance companies. And it goes in to explain, essentially, this individual, a doctor or physician dealing with Medicaid patients, cannot charge, they can't pass that tax on to the low-income people who they're in the first place receiving the service. So ultimately, people who are already doctors and practitioners facing economic challenges from taking all these low-income patients, because Medicaid reimbursements are not as high as either insurance or cash payers, they ultimately wind up having to take it out of their own pay, their own cost of living. And it is a very interesting dynamic discussion, and yet progressive controlled House in New Mexico, progressive controlled Senate, and governor, you don't hear a peep about this issue. And last point I forgot to read. There are the author of this petition says there are currently 550 practicing psychologists in the state of New Mexico, only 134 accept Medicaid and Medicare. Why? The author asks. One of the reasons is that this unfair tax continues to make it difficult for private practitioners to make a living and still serve the culture of poverty pervasive throughout this state. And I guarantee you this is a liberal progressive individual, given their line of work and the sacrifices they're undoubtedly making. I would expect, maybe I'm wrong, but they did have a petition put on moveon.org. So I think that speaks for itself. And this is the state of New Mexico literally acting as a highwayman. If you're a federal government official bringing sacks of money into New Mexico to help feed the poor, this is the equivalent of the state of New Mexico taking out a club, bludgeoning the government agent, the federal agent at the border of the state, and taking, in the case of Albuquerque, 7.875% of the money that they're bringing in here. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, and then one of the issues is that there was a fundamental tax precept that governments don't charge each other tax. Well, that's out the door in New Mexico completely. The other one that comes up frequently is our fees to manage our national laboratories, and they tend to go through lots of hoops and gyrations to make sure that those funds from the feds come into New Mexico as well. And right now, I don't know, given our spendthrift environment in Washington, nobody's looking at spending less government money, it seems like, at all right now. But when the time comes, and we know it will come, where the feds actually have to start thinking about how much they're spending because it's not sustainable and it's damaging our economy and our way of life even further, things like that could put New Mexico at a huge, huge disadvantage and a huge risk. Like, let's look at the people who are dealing with us the most unfairly, and those could be Medicaid and National Lab charges are two things that gross receipts tax gets. That if I were a federal policymaker, from a tax policy point of view, I'd want to take a good hard look at that.
Yeah, that kind of takes me into the next facet of this because, of course, given this legislative session, it was a very active session on the gross receipts tax. Unfortunately, not in reforming it, but simply grabbing more revenue. And you mentioned the national labs. Long story short, because of the way the gross receipts tax is implemented, nonprofits, such as certain nonprofits and universities that would manage the New Mexico labs, either Los Alamos or Sandia, would be exempted from taxation by the state and local governments. In this, Los Alamos County, Bernalillo County, whatever. This specific issue had to deal with Los Alamos National Lab. And Los Alamos, I don't know the whole history of it, but basically they had always been managed, I understand, by a nonprofit. Then a for-profit came in to manage it, and they were taxed. And then once you get hooked to that revenue source, you're very loath in government to give it up, and that's what we were looking at in the state. So legislation passed in this particular session to apply the gross receipts tax to nonprofit managers of Los Alamos National Labs in particular, although it would apply to Sandia. And the estimated revenue to the state of New Mexico annually, we're talking $25 to $30 million per year that is being brought into New Mexico, taken from the federal government. And by the way, other states with sales taxes, there is no direct taxation of that from the state level. Sales taxes are not applied to federal activities in maybe the 48 other states. I'm not sure about Hawaii in their particular, because they have, I consider it a gross receipts tax that's very robust. In Honolulu, it's 4.5%. The rest of the state, it's 4%. Still far lower than what we're dealing with in New Mexico, but $25 to $30 million. Now, theoretically speaking, Wally, President Trump has no love lost for New Mexico, although he seems to think he's going to win the state in 2020. But
he's judging that based on what he's done for the state economically, not whether people like him, evidently.
Right. Apparently, yeah, there's no voting preference here. People actually would vote their interest economically. In Karl Marx's world, New Mexico would be an 80% state for Trump. But Marx is wrong for many, many reasons, and economic determinism is just one of those that I believe is radically incorrect by Karl Marx. But looking at this situation, do you see a time where the federal government decides that they are sick of paying New Mexico's gross receipts tax, and they take a lab out of New Mexico, take some of this federal largesse away from us? I would think that there's got to be, this is what the Articles of Confederation, one of the reasons they were pushed to the curb is because other states were taxing using tariffs on items that were crossing borders from one state to the other. This is New Mexico, like I said, essentially holding up the federal government, and the federal government just takes it.
Well, hopefully the labs would not be the way that the federal government addressed it, but I could certainly see the federal government basically reducing their allocation to New Mexico because of that to make up for the gross receipts tax. So net that out. So it's like, okay, you're going to charge us 8%. We're going to give you 8% less. And if you would take that off, we would go ahead and restore that 8% in the form of funding to make that clear what's happening. But, never say never. It's one of those things. There are many things that qualify for the fourth rail of government in New Mexico, but the national labs and the military industrial spending that comes to New Mexico is certainly a huge one. One of the largest percentages of receipts of federal funds for things relative to what we send to Washington. And things like that don't have to happen in a very big way to be very detrimental to the economics of the state.
No doubt about it. And another way that New Mexico gets away with bad tax policy through the gross receipts tax involves hospitals. And you might be interested to know, you may never have thought about it. Loveless, of course, is one hospital that's active in New Mexico. They are a private corporation, or publicly traded, I think, but basically they are a corporation. They're not a nonprofit is what I'm getting at, whereas Presbyterian is a not-for-profit. And as we just mentioned, the gross receipts tax treats those very differently. I believe it's in the Tax Foundation's top 10 aspects of tax policy you want to treat like alike. And in New Mexico, the gross receipts tax was not like in the area of hospitals and their taxation under the gross receipts tax. So imagine, you're Loveless, you have catheters and medical equipment, et cetera, that you have to buy, all the things that are purchased by a hospital, and you're being taxed 7.875 on that each item. That adds up. And then unfortunately, in the United States, your medical billing is less than transparent, but you're ultimately paying a lot more taxation at a hospital like Loveless. Now, to be fair, under prior law, there was a 50% deduction to gross receipts taxes in the state. It just keeps getting curiouser and curiouser, more complicated. Basically, under HB 6, that's the tax rework that was put into place this session. Now, hospitals run by government agencies and nonprofits are subject to the gross receipts tax. Both for-profits and nonprofits are eligible for a 60% deduction. So basically, they're taxing a whole new category of hospitals, which UNMH would factor into the government-run hospitals. So government taxing government activities, fabulous stuff, and now giving higher deductions. Now, I realize that most folks, even ardent listeners of the Rio Grande Foundation's podcast, they are probably confused and scratching their heads at this point, but that is the problem inherently with the gross receipts tax. And these two policies, by the way, were on the table, or some variation thereof, as means to reform the gross receipts tax, lower the rates, fill in some of the gaps, and do all of this to make the gross receipts tax less onerous as a business-killing tax while not costing the state any revenue. If you ask me, with more than $1 billion surplus, likely again in 2020, revenue continuing to be strong, there is no excuse for the state legislature to not consider some form of gross receipts tax reform, and hopefully they would consider not using it as a massive revenue enhancement tool. But I suspect that given we already saw tax increases with a $1 billion surplus, that any effort to reform New Mexico's gross receipts tax, despite potentially another $1 billion in the bank, would result in some tax increases. So that is the reality that we're dealing with, Wally.
Yeah, and then the other issue is that it's interesting. You hear the term corporate welfare is basically any sort of tax deduction or tax policy that somebody doesn't like relative to a company. But the exemptions in gross receipts tax, whether those are fair or unfair, has a lot to do, I think, from the perspective of whether you're receiving one of those or watching some other industry receive that. And these exemptions are huge, is the other thing that really needs to be addressed. Senator Scher a few years ago proposed a plan that would eliminate most of the exemptions and put the gross receipts tax in the 1 or 2% range because all the exemptions were gone. Well, lobbyists and companies who pay them are not in the business of giving away an advantage they have in a taxation structure, even to pay a lower tax. And that thing didn't make it very far, although as a thought experiment, it was actually quite interesting to me that, a lot of people talked about it. But things like spaceport fuel have an exemption. There are a lot of things that are like, well, no, you can't tax spaceport fuel. People will go elsewhere. And there are just many like that, but there are a lot of them that have to do with the extractive industries, have exemptions, and there's very sound reasons for those. But, when you start looking at who gets an exemption and who doesn't, this has proven to be a slippery slope that New Mexico is having a hard time stopping the fall to the bottom in terms of granting these exemptions for things. There was the Southern New Mexico Rail Project that was put into place, and they had to exempt gross receipts tax on train fuel. So it's been used now as almost a real estate tax abatement. Is you abate these gross receipts tax forever if somebody will come into the state. And so it just violates. It's not broadly based. It carves out special rules for special companies, even, not even across an industry, and just adds further to the confusion.
I'm not 100% sure that was a gross receipts tax. I think it may have been a diesel fuel tax latched on to the state's gas tax. But anyway,
the
point remains.
The point remains, but also a lot of the exemptions of the gross receipts tax are because another tax takes their place, and so there is a kind of house of cards. And I would easily stand corrected on that if it wasn't gross receipts, but a lot of things happen in that way.
No doubt about it. Well, one of the other items that HB 6 changed in this session, one of the things that did to further exacerbate gross receipts tax burdens, and I get it that some on the right support this policy, but internet sales taxes were extended to sales from most businesses coming from out of state to New Mexico, even if they don't have a physical presence here. But did you know, we're not going to get into internet sales taxes. That's a whole different issue for another podcast. But when you pay for shipping, that gross receipts tax now applies to the shipping component of that purchase. That may not affect you too much if you are buying a relatively small item, but if you're a big business and you're shipping a lot in from out of state, that can be a very, very expensive proposition to have that tax applied. Again, this is very lacking in transparency. It's very confusing. Now, again, further complexity, at least currently, items shipped here from other states are only paying the statewide base of 5.125%. That is the statewide base. Everything on top of that is charged by county and other local governments. So the 7.875, you can essentially say, well, how much of that is the city? How much of that is the county, Bernalillo? And then everything below that is 5.125 from the state. It will add up on people's businesses. I talked to a online business entrepreneur here in New Mexico in the Bernalillo County area just last few days about this particular issue. And yeah, that's what he does, is he buys and sells sports memorabilia online, and he is going to now have a significant burden to pay to the state of New Mexico that was not going to be there. And the fact that the shipping is also taxed, it reminds me of, folks, if you go to the rental car agency, and I try to do rental cars for the financial benefit of the foundation, if you buy that pre-fuel package, like if you want to get the fuel filled up, you can run that thing to empty and return it, and they will fill it up for you for the pre-agreed price. Here's the catch. You're paying, of course, the federal and state fuel taxes, but you're also paying gross receipts taxes on that fuel in addition to everything else. So it is a way that the state nickels and dimes you to no end, lacking in transparency, lacking in simplicity. And folks, I would just, as we conclude here, simply echo the Albuquerque Journal editorial board. It is time to reform the gross receipts tax in New Mexico. It is not time to use this need for reform, this dire need to really take a hatchet to New Mexico's harmful gross receipts tax and raise taxes, especially in a time of massive budget surplus. But the $1 billion surpluses that we're seeing every year are a once in a lifetime, maybe once in a state lifetime opportunity to improve New Mexico's economy, to get the private sector rolling through this massive oil and gas bounty that we have coming from the Permian Basin. It would be the height of economic malpractice for our legislature not to act on the gross receipts tax. This is, theoretically speaking, a nonpartisan issue. None other than Bill McCamley, who was a state representative at the time, now is in the Lujan Grisham administration, talked and wrote about reform of the gross receipts tax as critical. It is high time to act. And I think if we're going to get any positive public policy out of the current legislature and governor, reform of the gross receipts tax is their best opportunity to leave a positive mark in our state.
Yeah, there will never be another time, in all likelihood, in our lifetime that will be as favorable for making that. And one of the reasons is that it's very complicated, and really they cannot predict down to the penny what a different structure will produce in terms of revenue and economic activity. Even if they know it's the right thing better, they could be a few $100 million off and might need to do some tweaks. Well, if you're in a budget deficit situation, there's no way that can fly. With $1 billion extra or $2 billion extra from the levels of spending a couple years, there will never be a better time than that. The reserves are there. You could create some short-term reserves in case they got it a little bit wrong, make a few tweaks the following year. But I think it could be extremely positive. And now is the time, or like they say, if not now, when?
Exactly. And kind of to take a Grover Norquist metaphor and apply it to this situation, kind of the equivalent of what we're looking at here is all the special interests of New Mexico are gathered around a big pot of soup at the campfire. And in the case of a pot of soup that is too small or just barely big enough to serve everyone, you're going to have tremendous difficulties reallocating those portion sizes and potentially offering a surplus, more soup to one group and cutting dramatically from other interest groups. In this case, we have, for the foreseeable future, as I see it with the Permian Basin, a surplus soup environment, and everybody can go home happy with a little bit extra money in their pockets, or each industry can be made not just whole, but have a positive environment with the tax reform if it's done in the near future. In a deficit situation, it is a whole different environment, very difficult. So let's take this soup surplus and do the right thing with it in Santa Fe, and gross receipts tax reform. Absolutely, it is time. Kudos to the Albuquerque Journal for acknowledging that on the editorial board, and Rio Grande Foundation will be working very hard to make the case, echo that case, amplify it, and make sure that policymakers have as much information as humanly possible. I can't say that even the most expert, and I would say that Representative Jason Harper of Rio Rancho is the most expert individual in the entire legislature on this complicated issue. But I hope we've shed some light on this without too much jargon and too much confusion.
Yeah, and I think if you were going to say what movie best represents the New Mexico gross receipts tax situation, the attitude, it's The Hunger Games. People die because of that. Industries are hurt. Families are hurt. We have some money to do something about it, and hopefully that will be the case. And looking forward, Paul, to seeing the work that the Rio Grande Foundation does on this important issue going into this next year's legislative session.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter. Tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.